Unveiling the Sheikh's Dark Secret. The Silent Witness. Hook. A forbidden affair, deadly secrets, and a shocking truth that could destroy everything. What happens when the lies begin to unravel? Watch till the end to uncover the dark twists no one saw coming. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with secrets. A dim light flickered above. It was almost too quiet, too still. She leaned against the window, watching the shadows outside. The world beyond seemed far away. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The distant hum of the city was a faint, constant buzz. Her fingers curled tighter around the cold metal of the blinds. Her heartbeat quickened. The silence around her felt suffocating. Then, the sound of a car door slamming echoed through the alleyway. She jumped, her breath catching in her throat. There was no reason for anyone to be out here at this hour. Not with the Sheikh's mansion looming above. The secrets it held, hidden beneath opulent walls and guarded gates. She glanced at the time. It was late, too late for a visitor. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her instincts kicked in. Her gaze swept across the room, stopping at the door. Something was wrong. A sudden creak of floorboards echoed from the hallway. Her heart raced as she stepped back. Someone was coming closer. Her hand shook as it hovered near the edge of the table, searching for something, anything she could use. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The door clicked open. She froze. For a moment, everything stopped. Then she saw him, the Sheikh. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. His usual composure was gone. It was as though he had seen a ghost. He stumbled inside, his breathing shallow. He didn't notice her standing there. He collapsed onto a chair. "Did you see it?" he whispered. His voice was frantic, barely audible. Her pulse spiked. "What happened?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He looked up, his gaze piercing her soul. "There's no time," he murmured. "The affair, it's not what you think." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The affair, the whispers, the rumors. What had he gotten himself into? His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. "This isn't just about us," he said. "This is bigger than we know." The phone buzzed in his hand. His eyes flickered to the screen. He froze, staring. The color drained from his face. A single word flashed on the screen. "Lori," she gasped, stepping back. The name hung in the air, suffocating. Lori. The woman everyone thought had been killed in a freak accident. But this was something else. He dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor. The screen shattered. He stood, pacing. "There's no going back now," he muttered. "The truth will destroy everything." The silence returned. But this time it was different. The weight of it pressed down on her chest. Her mind raced. She needed answers. But every answer she uncovered only led to more questions. The Sheikh's past was tangled in lies. And now, this affair was the key to something far darker. She couldn't back out. Not now. Not after hearing the truth. She had to know. She had to find out what he was hiding. The tension in the room was unbearable. The Sheikh's words hung in the air like a curse. She took a slow step forward, her mind racing. "What happened to Lori?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The Sheikh's gaze dropped to the floor. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He didn't speak right away. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, he whispered, "Lori didn't die in that accident. She was murdered." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her breath caught in her throat. She had always believed the official story. But now, her mind was spinning. "Who did it?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The Sheikh's eyes darted around the room, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "No one knows," he replied, his voice strained. "But I do." Her pulse quickened. She was hanging on every word. He looked at her with fear, desperation in his eyes. "I know who killed her." Her heart skipped a beat. She leaned in, urging him to continue. "Why don't you tell the police?" He shook his head violently. "No, I can't. Not yet." She stared at him, confused. His expression was full of regret, guilt, terrifying guilt. The truth was clearly eating him alive. "I have to stop this," he whispered, his voice broken, "before it destroys everything." She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. Everything had already begun to crumble. The room felt colder now, even though the heat from the lamps should have kept it warm. She shivered. The air seemed to be filled with an ominous energy. The Sheikh stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Where are you going?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes locked on her, dark and haunted. "I have to make sure it's over." He turned and walked toward the door. Her heart pounded in her chest. What was he planning to do? She couldn't let him go alone, not with all the pieces of the puzzle still scattered, half-formed in her mind. "Wait," she called out. But it was too late. He was gone. The door slammed shut behind him. The silence returned, heavier than ever. She stood there, alone in the darkened room, unsure of what to do next. Her mind screamed for answers, for resolution. But the more she thought, the more her fear grew. There was no escaping this. The Sheikh was tangled in something dangerous. And now, so was she. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her to the door. She opened it slowly, peeking into the hallway. The mansion was unnervingly quiet. No voices, no footsteps. She stepped into the dim corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. Where had he gone? She felt a chill race down her spine, as if the very walls of the house were watching her. Each step she took seemed to echo louder than the last. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old wood. Her hand grazed the edge of a painting as she passed, her fingers trembling. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find, but the silence felt suffocating, like a warning. She turned a corner and froze. At the far end of the hallway, a door creaked open. The faintest whisper of movement. Someone was inside. Her pulse spiked. The Sheikh. Was he in there? Without thinking, she moved toward the door, her breath shallow. The light inside flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. As she approached, a sharp, metallic scent hit her nose. Blood. Her stomach twisted. She pushed the door open with a trembling hand. And there he was, the Sheikh, standing by the desk. But this time, something was different. His back was turned to her, his posture rigid, and in his hands, a gun. It glinted in the dim light. She felt her throat go dry. What was he doing? "Sheikh," she whispered, stepping forward. He didn't move. His body was tense, as though he was waiting for something or someone. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. Was he going to do something dangerous? "Don't come any closer," he said quietly, his voice strained. She stopped. Her heart was hammering in her chest. "What's going on? Why do you have that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned slowly, his eyes dark with a mix of fear and anger. "Because I have to end this before it destroys everything." His words were cryptic, but there was an edge to his tone that made her stomach drop. He wasn't talking about just Lori anymore. She stepped back, her mind racing. The Sheikh's life was unraveling in front of her, and she was caught in the middle of it. "I have to stop them," he muttered to himself, more to the gun than to her. "Stop who?" she asked, almost too afraid to hear the answer. The Sheikh turned to face her fully, his expression more tortured than she had ever seen. "They'll kill us both if I don't stop them," he said, his voice trembling. Her stomach twisted. "Who?" But before he could answer, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. The door at the end of the hallway flew open. Figures emerged, masked, their movements swift and calculated. Her heart skipped a beat. The Sheikh's face drained of color. "Get down!" he shouted, lunging toward her. But it was too late. The men moved faster than she could react. The room filled with the sharp sound of footsteps, the sound of a struggle. She was shoved against the wall. The air knocked from her lungs. The Sheikh's gun fell to the floor. The metallic clink too loud in the chaos. Her vision blurred. But one thing was clear. They had been found. And there was no escaping now. The men moved swiftly, grabbing her by the arms. Her heart hammered in her chest, panic clawing at her throat. The Sheikh's eyes widened in horror. "No!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. But they shoved him back, forcing him to the ground. She fought, kicking, twisting, trying to break free. But their grip was iron, relentless. One of the men dragged her toward the door, his breath hot on her neck. The others held the Sheikh back, his struggles futile. Her mind raced. Why her? What did they want with her? As they pulled her through the hall, she caught a glimpse of the Sheikh, his face pale and defeated. His eyes met hers, filled with regret. "Get her out of here!" he screamed. The words stung her ears, but she couldn't focus on them. The world around her was spinning. They dragged her through the mansion, past ornate furniture, past dark corners that seemed to swallow the light. Each step took her further from the man she thought she knew, further into the unknown. Finally, they threw her into a dark room, slamming the door behind her. She hit the cold floor hard, gasping for air. Her mind struggled to catch up with reality. She pushed herself up, her body aching, her eyes scanning the shadows. The room was small, the only light coming from a single, flickering bulb overhead. A metal chair stood in the middle of the room, empty, cold. But she didn't need to be told. She knew why they had brought her here. They were going to break her. A creak from behind her made her turn. Two figures emerged from the dark. The leader and another man, their faces still hidden. The leader's eyes were cold, calculating. "Sit down," he commanded, his voice low, menacing. She stood frozen for a moment, her heart racing. Her legs shook, but she refused to give in. She was not going to play their game. But one look at the gun in his hand, its cold barrel glinting in the dim light, made her reconsider. Her hands trembled as she slowly lowered herself into the chair. She had no choice. The leader circled her like a predator, his eyes never leaving her. "We've been watching you," he said, his tone detached. "Everything you know, everything the Sheikh told you, it's all part of the game." Her stomach twisted. "What game?" "Lori is not the only one we've been keeping an eye on," he continued. "Everything you've been involved in, all these years, it's all connected." She shook her head, trying to piece together the fractured puzzle. What did he mean? The man stopped in front of her, leaning in close. "Tell me, did the Sheikh tell you everything?" Her breath caught in her throat. "Everything?" "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The leader's lips curled into a twisted smile. "I thought so." The door slammed open suddenly. The Sheikh's voice echoed from the hallway. "Stop. Leave her alone." But it was too late. The masked figures from before stormed into the room, their eyes cold with intent. One of them stepped forward and spoke, his voice icy. "It's time you understood who we are and why you're here." The air in the room thickened, as though something dark and suffocating was about to unfold. The leader's smile deepened. "Sit tight," he said with a chilling calm. He turned to the man beside him, who moved to the door and locked it behind him with a soft click. The Sheikh's voice continued to echo from the hallway, but the masked men just ignored it, their attention focused entirely on her now. The man who spoke earlier stepped forward, his eyes glittering with something sinister. "You're not here by accident," he said slowly, circling around her like a wolf sizing up its prey. Her breath quickened. Her mind was spinning. What were they talking about? She wasn't supposed to be part of this. She was just a witness to the affair. But now it was much bigger than she ever could have imagined. "We've been tracking the Sheikh for years," the man continued. "And you too. Your every move." Her heart dropped. "Tracking me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man nodded slowly. "Yes, you were always closer to the truth than you knew." His words hung in the air like a poison, creeping into her mind. "Why?" she asked, almost against her will. The man stopped in front of her, crouching to meet her eyes. "Because you're part of the puzzle." Her pulse thundered in her ears. "The Sheikh," he went on, "was never meant to rise to the position he's in. He had help from someone very close to you." Her mind scrambled. What was he talking about? She shook her head, struggling to make sense of it. "Who?" she gasped. But the man didn't answer right away. He stood up slowly, taking his time, savoring the moment. He nodded to the leader, who stepped forward with the gun in his hand, pointing it toward her. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. Her eyes darted between them, fear rising in her throat. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. The leader didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, keeping the gun trained on her. "We're giving you one last chance to understand," he said slowly. The other man spoke again. The Sheikh's rise wasn't about ambition. It was about control. A carefully laid plan, years in the making. She couldn't breathe. What was this plan? Her mind raced back through the conversations, the whispers, the moments of doubt she had felt. The affair. Lori. None of it had been an accident. "Lori," she whispered. "Yes," the man said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "She was never meant to die." Her head spun, trying to piece it together. But the accident, the crash. "Staged," he interrupted, his tone almost mocking. "Lori is alive. She's been with us all along. And now," he paused, his eyes narrowing, "and now you're going to help us finish this." The shock hit her like a wave, pulling her under. She tried to stand, but the masked men moved forward, pressing her back into the chair. "What do you want from me?" she gasped, her voice raw. The leader stepped closer, his eyes cold as steel. "We want you to stop running. You've been chasing the truth for too long, but you don't even know what it is." Her chest tightened. "Tell me," she demanded, barely able to speak over the roar of panic in her chest. "We're going to bring down everything the Sheikh built," the man said. "And you're going to help us." The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her body was frozen. The pieces were coming together, but they weren't the pieces she'd expected. She wasn't just a witness to the Sheikh's downfall. She was part of it, and there was no turning back. The cold air from the hallway cut through her, sending a chill down her spine. They marched her down the narrow corridor, her thoughts swirling. Each step felt like it took her further from the life she once knew, and closer to something darker, something she couldn't yet fully understand. The leader's voice echoed in her mind. "You either work with us, or you'll join Lori in the ground." She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. Her heart raced. She needed to think. She needed to act. As they reached the end of the hallway, one of the men shoved her into a small, dimly lit room. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating in her chest. For a moment, everything was silent. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, her body tense. The room was bare, save for a single chair in the center and a small table against the far wall. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she scanned the room, looking for any chance, any way to escape. Her eyes landed on the table, where a familiar object sat. The gun. The same gun that had been pointed at her earlier. It was just sitting there, inches from her reach. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. The sound of footsteps outside the door made her freeze. But the door remained closed. Her body was on high alert. If they were going to make her choose, if they were going to force her into this game, she wasn't going to let them do it without a fight. With shaky hands, she approached the table. Her fingers brushed against the cold steel of the gun. It felt heavy in her grasp, a weapon with the power to change everything. But could she do it? Could she pull the trigger? The door creaked open suddenly, breaking her concentration. The masked figures reappeared, their shadows filling the doorway. She backed away, instinctively clutching the gun tighter. The leader stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "Still thinking?" he asked, his voice low. Her heart thudded in her chest as she held the gun in front of her. "I'm not part of your plan," she said, her voice shaking but determined. The leader smiled, unfazed. "Everyone is part of the plan," he replied, stepping closer. "But the question is, how far are you willing to go to protect yourself?" She tightened her grip on the gun. Her mind raced. The Sheikh's words, his warnings, echoed in her head. He had known. He had known all along that the truth was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. And now, she was stuck in the middle of it all. The leader stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the coldness in his eyes. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could either let them take control, let them turn her into a puppet, or she could take a stand. She swallowed, trying to calm the whirlwind inside her. "Make your choice," the leader said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Her pulse thudded in her ears, her breath shallow. Her finger hovered over the trigger, her mind a blur of doubt and fear. But one thing was clear, she wasn't going down without a fight. She aimed the gun at him. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You don't have it in you." But she did. In a split second, she pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the small room. And then everything went black. The world seemed to slow as the sound of the gunshot reverberated in her ears. For a moment, there was silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Her heart hammered in her chest, her hand still gripping the cold, heavy gun. She blinked, her eyes wide, waiting for something to happen. Anything. But nothing did. The leader stood frozen in place, staring at her. The gunshot had missed. It had missed by a fraction of an inch. A sharp pain erupted in her chest as she realized the depth of her mistake. But she couldn't think about that now. She had to act. Her mind screamed at her to run, to do something, anything, but her body felt like it was trapped in slow motion. The leader's eyes flickered to the gun in her hand, then back to her face, a twisted smile beginning to form on his lips. "You'll regret that," he said, his voice dark with amusement. She didn't wait for him to make a move. In a flash, she bolted for the door, her legs carrying her with a strength she didn't know she had. She barely heard the leader's shout as she ran, her only focus the hallway ahead, the dim light at the end, the chance to escape. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath ragged as she sprinted through the maze-like halls. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury, now felt like a prison. She rounded corners blindly, her mind struggling to process everything that had happened. The Sheikh, Lori, the men in masks. It was all tangled in her mind like a web she couldn't escape. As she turned another corner, she collided with someone. The force knocked her off balance, sending her crashing to the ground. She gasped for air, her body aching, her vision blurred. But before she could react, a hand grabbed her wrist, yanking her up. Her heart stopped. It was the Sheikh. His face was pale, his eyes wide with urgency. "Come with me," he whispered, pulling her down another hallway, away from the sounds of footsteps behind them. She didn't know whether to trust him, but she didn't have a choice. He dragged her through a small door, out into a hidden courtyard, the cool night air hitting her like a slap to the face. They were outside, free for now, but she knew the danger wasn't over. The Sheikh stopped, breathing heavily, looking over his shoulder. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low and tense. "I know," she replied, her voice shaking. "We need to go." We need to get as far away from here as possible. And for the first time in what felt like days, she truly felt like she had a chance to escape. But as they moved toward the exit, a cold, unsettling feeling crept up her spine. They weren't free yet, not by a long shot. And the truth was, their nightmare was only just beginning. The cool night air stung her skin as she and the Sheikh made their way through the courtyard, every step filled with a growing sense of urgency. She kept her eyes on the shadows ahead, knowing that even though they had escaped the mansion, they hadn't escaped the nightmare. The silence of the night felt deafening. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. The gunshot, the leader's cryptic words, the revelation that Lori wasn't dead. The Sheikh was still leading her, his grip on her arm firm but steady. She could hear his breathing, heavy and strained, but there was something in his eyes now, a glimmer of hope perhaps, or maybe just the exhaustion of someone who had been running for far too long. "You're safe now," he whispered almost to himself as they reached the edge of the courtyard. Safe. She wanted to believe him, but the truth was that she had no idea where they were heading or what was going to happen next. But she did know one thing. She couldn't stop now. They reached a small gate at the far side of the courtyard. It creaked as the Sheikh pushed it open, revealing a dark alley beyond. "You're sure this is the way?" she asked, her voice strained with doubt. The Sheikh paused, glancing over his shoulder. "I'm sure," he said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but time was running out. They had to keep moving. They had to get as far away from the mansion as possible. They slipped into the alley, the gate closing softly behind them, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. No masked figures, no gun, no shadows lurking behind them. But that peace was short-lived. Just as they reached the end of the alley, a dark car pulled up beside them. Before she could react, the door swung open, revealing the very man who had led her to this point. The leader. He stepped out slowly, his face hidden in the shadows, but his presence unmistakable. "Did you really think you could escape?" His voice echoed through the alley. She felt her stomach tighten. Her eyes darted to the Sheikh, who was now standing frozen beside her. The man smiled, a wicked smile that sent a chill down her spine. "You should have stayed where you were," he said softly. But as he spoke, something shifted in the Sheikh's eyes, a flash of something deep within him, a decision made in the darkest corners of his mind. Before the leader could make another move, the Sheikh stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "This ends tonight." The tension in the air was unbearable, thick as smoke. And for the first time in days, she felt the truth wrap around her like a tightrope. The game was over. Whatever the Sheikh's plans had been, whatever the leader wanted, none of it mattered anymore. She stepped forward, her heart steady now, knowing that there would be no turning back. With a swift movement, the Sheikh reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek device. The leader's eyes widened in recognition, but it was too late. With a single push of a button, the world around them shifted. Darkness descended, and the game they had all been playing ended in the only way it could, a final, silent truth.